who made the decision to create this waste that you all want to categorize as some small percentage were so careless with the use of taxpayer dollars that it requires us to question all of the activities that you are going to. Because I reject the premise that I should say, well, the same person who thought a transgender play in Uganda was a good idea is somehow being responsible with the rest of the money. What folks should particularly understand is none of this money was actually paid for. All of it was borrowed from our children and grandchildren. So to have money that we have to pay back in the future be spent in such a callous and uncaring way that makes a laughingstock of our foreign policy, I think is a real disgrace. And what I would say to the people who are upset about this is they should be upset at the people who created the conditions that allow these agencies to be upset. Had these absolutely insane examples not been out.
So we have before us, in this ghastly moment of manufactured outrage and cultural warfare cynicism, a Republican congressman weaponizing human suffering to score political points, and you can feel the rotting heart of contemporary conservatism pumping its venom through every single word he utters, because what we're watching here is something even more obscene than garden-variety hypocrisy, something that transcends mere political opportunism and reaches into a territory so morally depraved that it should make every single person watching recoil in horror and disgust when they understand what's actually happening beneath the surface of this performance. This GOP representative is ridiculing the very concept of a theatrical production related to transgender individuals in Uganda, while Uganda has enacted one of the world's most brutal anti-LGBTQ laws prescribing life imprisonment for consensual same-sex conduct and the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality. And the sheer audacity of that juxtaposition should take your breath away, because what he's calling wasteful spending is actually the United States attempting to support human rights in a country where the Anti-Homosexuality Act has ramped up already existing abuse and discrimination against LGBT people to unprecedented heights, where people are being murdered and raped and driven from their homes simply for existing in their authentic identities. And here's where this becomes a masterclass in reactionary cruelty dressed up as fiscal responsibility, because the congressman wants you to believe that the problem is some transgender theater production, but the real story is that Uganda USAID offered emergency assistance to LGBTQI+ human rights defenders who were victims of violence, evicted from their homes, or needed medical care in the wake of the Anti-Homosexuality Act, and when activists like Stephen Kabuye were stabbed by attackers on motorcycles, who he believes targeted him because of his public LGBT rights activisms. This is the infrastructure that kept people alive. But now we're supposed to laugh along with this sanctimonious fiscal warrior, who thinks borrowing money from our children and grandchildren is the real scandal, while he's perfectly content with America standing by as close to 600 people have been subjected to human rights violations and abuses based on their actual or imputed sexual orientation or gender identity since the act was enacted. Think about the grotesque moral calculus at work here, and you'll start to understand that this isn't about budgets at all, because what this Republican is actually doing is collaborating with genocidal policy by treating the persecution of LGBTQ people as a punchline, and you need to sit with that for a moment, because the laughter he's trying to elicit is laughter at life-saving human rights work. The architecture of this deception runs deep because Republicans have compiled lists of what they call waste, including transgender-related cultural programs, while citing minimal oversight, and they're deploying this strategy across the board with almost $200 million in questionable spending by USAID cited by Republicans who won't voice support for the actual programs, but instead say they don't believe the evidence even exists, which tells you everything about how the culture war machinery operates in practice, because they've found a handful of programs they can mock and ridicule and hold up as emblematic of everything wrong with foreign aid, while ignoring the fact that only about 0.7% of the federal budget goes to USAID, and the largest grants went to combating HIV/AIDS with $6 billion to development firms, and malaria with $2.5 billion, and Pfizer received $4 billion for international COVID-19 vaccine development. But that doesn't fit the narrative, does it? Because you can't get your base frothing at the mouth over life-saving vaccines and malaria prevention the way you can by sneering at transgender people in Uganda, trying to survive state-sanctioned violence. And we need to understand the historical context here, because Uganda's horrific legislation didn't emerge in a vacuum. American evangelical Scott Lively has visited Uganda many times and spoken extensively with cabinet ministers and members of parliament involved in writing and passing the Anti-Homosexuality Act. which means American religious extremists have been actively exporting hatred to Africa for decades while British colonizers introduced legislation that banned homosexuality, forcing their views and ideologies onto people living in Uganda, where same-sex relationships between men were deemed sinful and later became completely illegal. So when this congressman talks about making a laughingstock of American foreign policy, what he's really upset about is that America was trying to partially remedy the colonial and evangelical violence that created this nightmare in the first place. The intellectual dishonesty is staggering, because these same conservatives will lecture endlessly about American exceptionalism and our responsibility to spread freedom and democracy, but the moment that freedom includes the radical notion that queer and trans people deserve to live, they suddenly discover the virtues of non-interference and fiscal restraint. And it's such transparent bad faith that it borders on parody, except people are dying, so it's not funny at all. Look at what's actually happening on the ground in Uganda right now, and you'll see that the government has followed up the legislation with a campaign of persecution, including widespread police abuse, harassment, extortion, and arbitrary arrests based on perceived or actual sexual orientation. LGBTQ people face technology-facilitated gender-based violence, including doxing, outing, threats of violence, blackmailing, impersonation, hacking and disinformation with the Anti-Homosexuality Act, fostering a climate of impunity, forcing individuals and organizations to radically alter how they present themselves online, just to survive, and this is the environment where American support for something as seemingly innocuous as a theatrical production about transgender experiences becomes literally life or death, because theater and art and cultural expression are how marginalized communities assert their humanity and their right to exist. When you're dealing with a government that has upheld provisions allowing up to 20 years in prison for the promotion of homosexuality, which could apply to anyone advocating for the rights of LGBT people, including representatives of human rights organizations, or those providing financial support, then every single dollar America invests in visibility and representation and cultural acknowledgement is a direct challenge to genocidal ideology masquerading as traditional values. But this congressman and his Republican colleagues have decided that the real enemy isn't the authoritarian regime imposing death penalties for consensual adult relationships. The real enemy is the woke bureaucrats who think American taxpayer dollars should support universal human rights, and now we're living through the consequences of their ideological crusade, because Project 2025 calls for USAID to cease the promotion of DEI and what they call the bullying LGBTQ+ agenda in foreign assistance, and nearly all documents and pages affiliated with LGBTQI Boston-specific programming have been scrubbed from the USAID website, which means the Trump administration's attacks on USAID aren't just about efficiency or waste reduction, they're about systematically dismantling America's capacity to support human rights globally. The sudden withdrawal of funding is a direct attack on the human rights, dignity, and survival of trans and gender diverse communities around the world, with HIV transmission rates surging without access to treatment and prevention, reversing decades of hard-won progress. This is what austerity politics looks like when married to cultural reaction, and it's absolutely devastating because the National Democratic Institute has been forced to terminate 93 of its 97 awards, close most of its offices, and fire 1,000 staff members, while the International Republican Institute ended 92 of its 95 programs, closed all 64 offices overseas, and let 85% of its staff go, which represents the complete gutting of American democracy promotion infrastructure worldwide. And here's the part that should radicalize anyone paying attention, because when this Republican congressman talks about money being borrowed from our children and grandchildren, he's engaging in the most cynical form of generational concern trolling imaginable, since Republicans just muscled through Trump's tax and spending cut bill without Democratic support, and the Congressional Budget Office has projected that measure will increase the U.S. debt by about $3.3 trillion over the coming decade, which means they're perfectly happy to explode the deficit when it benefits their wealthy donors, but suddenly discover fiscal responsibility when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable people on Earth from state violence. The moral bankruptcy is complete and total, because 73% of Republicans favor decreasing U.S. aid funding, compared to only 33% of Democrats. Which tells you this isn't about sound budgeting. It's about the Republican base being conditioned to see foreign aid as wasteful, precisely because it helps people they've been taught to view as undeserving or threatening, or morally suspect, and that includes queer and trans people struggling to survive in countries where their governments want them dead. The congressman's rhetoric about absolutely insane examples and callous and uncaring spending is designed to make you think the absurdity lies in the programs themselves rather than in his response to them. But consider the actual landscape of American foreign aid spending, where the administration coupled foreign aid programs unpopular with MAGA voters with perennial culture war targets like NPR and PBS, because Trump targeted an exceedingly narrow slice of federal spending, primarily so-called culture war programs, which proves this entire exercise is about ideological purification rather than fiscal responsibility. They're not actually interested in whether programs work, or whether they save lives, or whether they advance American interests in the world. They're interested in whether those programs conform to their reactionary vision of what deserves support and what doesn't. And since they've decided that LGBTQ people, especially LGBTQ people in the global south, don't deserve support, then any dollar spent helping them becomes by definition wasteful, regardless of the outcomes. What makes this particularly insidious is how Republicans have weaponized legitimate questions about foreign aid effectiveness to pursue a fundamentally illegitimate agenda, because yes, we should scrutinize how American tax dollars are spent abroad, and yes, we should demand accountability and measurable outcomes. That's not what's happening here at all, since Republicans have cited activities they disagree with to portray a wide range of program funding as wasteful, including OMB Director Russ Vought criticizing diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, and citing a 2022 NPR program about sexuality in the animal kingdom and a CNN town hall with Sesame Street about combating racism, which reveals the game completely, because they're treating education about racism and discussions of sexuality as inherently illegitimate uses of public resources. This is eliminationist politics dressed up in the language of government efficiency, and it's working because they've managed to convince large swaths of the American public that the problem with foreign aid is that it's too focused on social issues, rather than the problem being that authoritarian governments are murdering their citizens for their sexual orientation or gender identity. The congressman mentions that none of this money was actually paid for, and that's technically true in the sense that the federal government runs deficits, but it's a profoundly dishonest framing because it implies that borrowed money for human rights protection is somehow more problematic than borrowed money for anything else government does, and it completely erases the fact that democracy, human rights, and governance programming provides strategic value by improving stability, fostering alliances, and gaining perspectives from communities beyond elite circles, while advocates have long pointed out its connection to the sustainability of other development efforts, which means cutting these programs doesn't just abandon vulnerable people, it undermines every other development goal America pursues, from public health to economic development to security cooperation. You cannot build sustainable development on a foundation of human rights violations, and when you withdraw support from the activists and organizations documenting abuses and advocating for change, you're guaranteeing that whatever other investments America makes will eventually crumble, because societies that systematically persecute minorities are societies that are unstable, violent, and hostile to American interests in the long run. And we need to talk about what it means that Republicans are specifically targeting programs related to gender and sexuality, because this isn't coincidental, this is the core of their ideological project right now. Since Trump administration officials have attacked USAID spending on family planning, gender, and climate-related issues, with former senior USAID officers noting this parallels the first Trump administration, when political appointees suddenly attacked USAID's work on gender and democracy and human rights, which tells you the culture war at home and the culture war exported abroad are the same war. When conservative politicians demonize trans people in America and slash support for trans people in Uganda, those aren't separate phenomena. They're part of a unified ideological agenda that views gender nonconformity as a threat to hierarchical social order, and when they talk about traditional values, what they mean is patriarchal Christian nationalism that has no tolerance for queer liberation anywhere on earth. This is why the congressman can so easily mock a transgender play in Uganda, because in his worldview supporting that play, supporting trans existence anywhere, is itself the problem rather than the solution. The language about making American foreign policy a laughingstock is particularly revealing because it assumes that the international community shares his derision for LGBTQ rights programming, when in fact, following Uganda's adoption of the Anti-Homosexuality Act, the U.S. imposed visa restrictions on Ugandan officials, removed Uganda from duty-free trade programs, and the World Bank halted new lending, which means the international consensus was that Uganda's law was abhorrent, and American support for human rights was appropriate and necessary. The only people laughing are authoritarians and bigots who are delighted that America is abandoning its human rights commitments, and human rights activists say the funding freeze is a gift to authoritarians like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, because when America withdraws from the field, It creates space for authoritarian powers to expand their influence without having to worry about human rights conditionality. This is what losing looks like in the 21st century, and Republicans are celebrating it as a victory because they've decided that owning the libs and punishing transgender people is more important than American global leadership. What this congressman is asking you to do is accept his framing that fiscal responsibility requires abandoning people facing genocide, and that's not fiscal responsibility, that's moral abdication dressed up in the rhetoric of common sense budgeting, and the reason this framing is so dangerous is because it works on people who aren't paying close attention, who hear transgender play in Uganda, and think that sounds frivolous without understanding that under Uganda's law health services, focusing on the needs of key populations run the risk of criminal charges, and the law includes criminalization of the promotion of homosexuality, imposing up to 20 years imprisonment for any act that promotes being LGBTQ+, including providing financial support, which means American support for LGBTQ cultural expression isn't some woke luxury. It's a matter of physical survival for people who will be imprisoned or killed if the international community doesn't push back against Uganda's eliminationist agenda. Theater and art and visibility are how you create the cultural conditions for human rights to be defended, and when you defund those programs, you're not saving money, you're enabling atrocity. The congressman says people should be upset at the people who created the conditions that allow these agencies to be upset, and that's the most spectacular example of conservative victim blaming, because he's arguing that if USAID hadn't funded programs Republicans find objectionable, then Republicans wouldn't have to gut the entire foreign aid infrastructure, which is like arguing that if your neighbor hadn't put up a pride flag, you wouldn't have had to burn down the whole neighborhood. It's an argument that makes sense only if you already accept the premise that LGBTQ rights programming is inherently illegitimate, and therefore any retaliation against it is justified, and that premise is what we're fighting against, because once you accept that governments have the right to criminalize and kill people for their sexual orientation or gender identity, then you've abandoned any coherent theory of universal human rights, and you've reduced international relations to a cynical calculus, where might makes right, and the most vulnerable people in the world have no claim on our moral imagination or our material support. Look at the infrastructure that's being destroyed in real time because said funding supported safe houses protecting environmental activists and opposition politicians from authoritarian states, and after Trump's executive order cut off funding those safe houses which were home to 35 activists, and their family members began closing, which means real human beings who fled persecution are now being abandoned, and when hundreds of thousands of people in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo were fleeing violence, the administration's order to pause development assistance occurred while they gathered in Goma, where aid organizations funded by USAID were forced to immediately stop providing clean water, increased the likelihood of cholera, and these aren't abstract policy questions, these are life and death realities where American withdrawal has immediate catastrophic consequences. But this congressman wants you to believe the real scandal is that some of that money went to support transgender visibility in Uganda, and if you accept that framing you're accepting that some lives are worth saving and others aren't, and that the lives that aren't worth saving are queer and trans lives, and that's not a budget position, that's a moral position, and it's a morally reprehensible one. The Republican Party has made a calculated decision that anti-LGBTQ sentiment is a reliable tool for political mobilization, and they're willing to sacrifice American global leadership, human rights protections, and the lives of countless vulnerable people in service of that political strategy, because Republican foreign aid bills include prohibitions on funding for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives, and any activity that advances critical race theory, a ban on funding for drag queen workshops, performances, or documentaries, and prohibitions on gender-affirming care and flying pride flags, which proves this isn't about fiscal conservatism, it's about imposing a reactionary social agenda globally, using budget authority as the enforcement mechanism. They're treating human rights as a partisan issue, and LGBTQ existence as a political statement, rather than a fact of human diversity. When you do that, you're not engaging in legitimate policy debate, you're engaging in ideological warfare where the casualties are real people, and the spoils are a political base that's been successfully mobilized through hatred and fear. This moment demands we understand that what's being attacked isn't just foreign aid, or even just LGBTQ rights. It's the entire premise of universal human dignity and international solidarity, because if America can abandon people facing genocide in Uganda because supporting them is politically inconvenient for Republicans, then America can abandon anyone facing anything, and that's not hyperbole. That's the logical endpoint of the arguments being made here. You cannot maintain a coherent human rights framework that excludes queer and trans people, because human rights are by definition a universal and indivisible, and when you start carving out exceptions, you've destroyed the whole edifice, because now rights are contingent on political convenience and social acceptability and power dynamics, rather than on the inherent dignity of human beings. And once you've done that, there's no principle left to defend, only interests and force, and the strong dominating the weak, which is the opposite of everything America has claimed to stand for in the world for the last 80 years. So when you watch this clip and you hear this congressman performing his outrage about borrowed money and fiscal irresponsibility and laughingstock foreign policy, understand that what you're really watching is the articulation of a worldview where some people deserve to die because who they are threatens the social order he wants to preserve, and where American power should be deployed not to protect the vulnerable, but to enforce hierarchy, and where the greatest scandal isn't murder and persecution, but rather the attempt to resist murder and persecution through cultural programming and visibility campaigns. That's what's at stake here, and that's why this matters far beyond the specifics of one USAID program or one Republican congressman's talking points, because we're watching in real time the dismantling of the architecture of human rights protection and its replacement with a brutal calculus where only the politically useful deserve support, and everyone else can be sacrificed on the altar of culture war, point scoring, and deficit reduction. And that's not a future anyone who cares about justice should accept, which means we fight back, not just against specific budget cuts, but against the entire moral framework that makes those cuts possible, because once you accept that framework, once you accept that some lives are worth less than others, you've already lost everything worth fighting for,